Socialist Links. Here I want to talk about the American Civil War in the midst of, well, the fact that in the midst of Juneteenth and in the fact of the history of the American Civil War, and actually quite the radical history that that the American Civil War has, that most people really do not talk about entirely. Here I want to make a video on a lot about the American Civil War and on how in some way, actually, in reality, it was possibly the greatest or possibly the biggest socialist revolution from the working class and slaves and slave classes of the United States of America has ever created in its time. I hope you like this video. If you do, then leave a like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button too. I'd also very much appreciate it. Without further ado, though, let's actually get started and talk about the American Civil War. But first, when we talk about the American Civil War, we have to understand on how slavery worked within the United States of America. In the early 19th century, when colonizers in Europe expanded their territories within the United States of America, slavery was seen as a viable option in order to reconstruct America, in order to make a colonized state within America, all over the Americas, as a way to have colonizers and settlers settle within America. What would be done is that Africans were usually kidnapped from their homes forcefully by Europeans and forcefully brought to America, to where they would work for the rest of their lives as slaves and as property in order for them to massively expand the America and a lot of the settlements that America would produce. No, this is before the United States of America was essentially declared, and was usually a practice that was adopted by the French Empire, the British Empire, and the Spanish Empire as well, of the three European nations that colonized America. Even after the American Revolution happened, slavery was still a very adopted practice, and slavery was still a very adopted practice in order to expand American industry in the agricultural sector of production within the United States of America, even after its bourgeois revolution. And after capitalism had expanded massively within Europe, and has even grown further industry within the United States, slavery was still an adopted practice still. The founding fathers had hoped that slavery would go away due to the economic relations of feudalism at the time before the bourgeois revolution that happened, that indicated that slavery would soon go away, and there would be a massive expansion of of farmers and self-employed farmers at that, in order to get profit from their own production. However, they did not even anticipate their own revolutionary goals for when industry did come about, and when there was a generalization of the market, as in the systems in which commodities exchange, a way to basically produce cheaper labor, and a way in which for aristocrats and various slavers, in order to get profit from the then new growing market machine, was a way in order to do that was to essentially employ the cheapest labor possible at that time. That was slavery. So, in actuality, slavery had actually expanded all over the South after capitalism was essentially instituted around the 1820s. After the 1820s, when the period of transformation between feudalism to capitalism was completed, and capitalism had been set into place. Through this, slavery actually became the very foundation of socioeconomic and economic production process within the generalization of commodity production and market exchange in the South of the United States. Black slaves were now owned by wealthy elites within the South, that denied them education, denied them any form of representation, and treated them as property, because to them they were property by technicality, according to them. And they would not let the slaves would let them have the fruits of their own labor, as in the very cotton that they would produce from their hard-working hands, and rather that this cotton would then actually be exchanged into the market, for which the wealthy elites, as in the slavers, would profit from selling this cotton to various capitalist nations such as France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and various other nations around this time. This entire system itself was widely profitable, and what ended up happening was that it ended up having the wealthy elite be able to control a lot of Southern society, and quite a lot on the rules of law within the country entirely, not even just in the South. It was a domination of politics and economics within the South, and also of the entire United States of America. Even in the North, when slavery was not really adopted in a generalized format, various slave aristocrats and various slavers still had a lot of say into various economic policies and also political programs within the North, when these Southern aristocrats did not really live in these nations at the point, but were able to still make policy and were still able to influence policy directly into the bourgeois state, due to their wealth and due to their social relations to the means of production, for them owning literal people and having them produce cotton that would act as a commodity within the capitalist state machine of a slave law and remain. And this practice was not even just in the United States, but was still expanding all across the Western Hemisphere. In 1860, the United States of America, Cuba, and Brazil had the most enslaved populations in the world, and had them as a generalized practice to produce agricultural commodities that would be sold into the market for the slavers, in order to get massive amounts of profit from selling this, and also from various European capitalist nations to widely profit from this, in order for then that cotton to produce even more commodities that would be turned into coats, into hats, and various other clothing products that, instead of acting as utilities, they would act as commodities, as in products produced for exchange value. In exchanging money for then commodities, the actual lives of the slaves and the lives of the working class within the United States and Europe was massively ignored, and the actual uses of the products that they could have been used entirely was not really in consideration, but rather the consideration was based on the exchange, and how profitable it would be to exchange cotton and clothes in order to gain a medium of circulation, that is money. A medium of circulation that would be a representation of wealth and how wealthy you are. This was massively exploitive. The slave happiness was at the all-time low around this point. Many people were unsatisfied with the entire economic policies, even not even the slaves, but also even workers within the nation. Many people were getting diseases. There was massive amounts of poverty around this point. There was very low conditions of living within slave holdings, but also and plantations, but also within worker dominated neighborhoods as well, and various other problems that essentially expanded around this point. And this was massively exploitive, alienating, and absolutely just a domination and abomination of human life and human law within the world. And this is not just a thing that essentially that did happen. Many people saw this happening, and many people demanded change for happen. For a long time after this point, a group of abolitionists called slavery for what it was, as an abomination and exploitive nature against slaves. Unfortunately, however, these people were usually scorned by the bourgeois state and was very much ignored by the two major political parties at the time, until a new party would come about in the fall of a previous political party system within the United States that would actually massively expand then a new change for revolutionary conditions, and a new change of a revolutionary situation to become a violent revolution, where the working class would rise up against the slave elites and the bourgeoisie within the United States of America, and would massively empower and inspire the working class of Europe to try and rise up against the bourgeoisie within Europe. In the 1850s, as the slave aristocrats and various slavers tried to expand slavery in the United States through the use of the Democratic Party and the policies that they tried to implement through that, their opponents of the opponents of the Democratic Party made a breakthrough, and the old Whig Party was disbanded, and the new Republican Party was established as a way where they could call for the abolition of slavery and call for the new transformational aspect of America and change the entire relations of the economic system fully. The Republican Party won massive entire support by putting human lives over capital, and by opposing slavery expansion, and by opposing any form of bondage at all, both financial and also slave bondage, and put it in a way where it would lead to ultimate extinction within the United States, in their own words. As in, the abolitionists were able to win due to the fact that they were able to create some form of concrete breakthrough and intellectual analysis to call the slave system of the United States of America for what it was: a domination of a ruling class of a minority population of a ruling class over a non-ruling class that made up the majority of the population. They correctly pointed out on how the slave aristocrats of the South were only made up 1% of the population within the United States of America, yet controlled almost every aspect of politics within it. They argued that black bondage entirely was not just morally wrong and also destructive to human lives, but they also argued that black bondage and slave bondage entirely was a threat to free labor everywhere, and was a threat to laboring and the rights of labor for humans entirely everywhere around the world. They called for the entire full seizement of the cotton industry and the commodification of it, and they called for full entire control of each product that is produced, and the control of a collective effort from the people entirely that would use the products based on the use value of them to each individual a part of society, rather than acting as a commodity where it's abstracted away from society in an objective reason to exist, for an abstracted objective reason to exist, for there to essentially be an exchange between cotton and money that would act as a commodity for the holder of a commodity to get profit. And this was not just in America. Many other Europeans and various other radicals within Europe started going on this. In fact, after the revolution of 1848 within Germany, many German communists decide to immigrate within America to actually fight among the Republican Party and fight among them, to which they can actually expand their goals into reducing the expansion of slavery and see the emancipation of slaves by the slaves themselves entirely. There was many communists like this, such as Josef Wiedemer, a very close comrade to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels; August Willich, a close comrade to Karl Schleiper, Friedrich Schleiermacher, and Friedrich Engels; Franz Anck, who was quite close with Friedrich Engels; and Karl Schwarz, who was a German communist, a part of the Revolution of 1848; Louis Blenker, another German communist, a part of the revolutions of 1848; Franz Sigel, a German communist that was a part of the Banden Revolution, which was a small state within Germany that rised up against the German monarchy to establish a commune; Gustav Stroff, who was another German that fought within the German Revolution of 1848; and Friedrich Haeckel, another German revolutionary communist that fought in the 1848 revolution in Germany. These were socialists and communists that fought into an actual revolution within Germany, and fought that based on the emancipation of the working class by the working class themselves, that were forcibly exiled by the German state, by the German bourgeois state, to where they were exiled to America, to then where they can actually then influence more radicalism and fight within another revolutionary aspect to overthrow the political system and economic system within the United States of America that was being capitalism with a slave law and remain at the time. To where not only would they see just a massive, where they would see just a massive fight against slavery, but also a way where they can see the full emancipation and full liberation of humanity entirely in a society without classes, private property, the state, or money, or commodity production entirely. Even Abraham Lincoln himself even expressed various sympathies towards the class analysis that many of the German communists that were immigrating into America had expressed, saying in a debate at Alton, quote, "That is the real issue. That is the issue that will continue in this country when these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself shall be silent. It is the internal struggle between these two principles, right and wrong, throughout the world. They are the two principles that have stood face to face in the beginning of time and will ever continue to struggle. The one that is the common right of humanity, and the other the divine right of kings. It is the same principle in whatever shape it develops itself. It is the same spirit that says, 'You work and toil and earn bread and I'll eat it.' No matter in what shape it comes, rather from the mouth of a king who seeks to bestride the people of his own nation and live by the fruit of their labor, or from one race of men, apology of enslaving another race, it is the same tyrannical principle." End quote. Abraham Lincoln, debate at Alton. He might as well have been quoting Karl Marx in a work that he would write in 1861, where Karl Marx says, "Now was all the secret chapter of history? Was the admission of Miss Bridger Stowe wanted to reveal the examer of the political Illuminati of the London press, the carefully hidden truth that, quote, up to that time of the slave party used the Union for their purposes?" End quote. Is it the fault of the American North and that the English pressmen were taken quite unawareness of the violent clash of the antagonistic forces, the friction of which was the moving power of its history for a half a century? Is it the fault of the Americans that the English press mistake as a futile Kossuth hatched in a single day what was in reality the matured result of long years of struggle? The very fact of the formation and the progress of the Republican Party in America have hardly been noticed by the London press speaks volumes as to the hollowness of the anti-slavery tirades. Take, for instance, of the two antipodes of the London press, the London Times and Reynolds Weekly newspaper, the one of the great organ of the respectable classes, and the other only on the remaining organ of the working class. The former, not long before Miss Buchanan's career drew to an end, published of the elaborate apology for his administration of the defamatory libel against the Republican movement. Reynolds, on his part, was during Mr. Buchanan's stay at London one of his few minions, and since that time never missed an occasion to write him up and to write his advisories down. How did it come to pass that the Republican Party, whose platform was drawn up of the avoided antagonism to the encroachments of the slaveocracy and abuse of the Union by the slave interest, carried the day in the North? How in the second instance did it come to pass that the great bulk of the Northern Democratic Party, fingering aside the old concessions of the leaders of the slaveocracy, setting at naught the traditions of a half-century, sacrificing great commercial interests, and greater political prejudices, rushed to support the present Republican administration, and offered men and money with an unsparing hand? Karl Marx, The American Question in England. This was an entire class struggle within America being put into practice hand in hand, and actually finally setting into a full antagonism of violent political uprising from the slaves and the working class of America, siding within the Union cause of the American Civil War, and the Confederacy that essentially rebelled against the rising radicals of the Republican Party and desired to preserve the slave bondage and the capitalist rule of law with a slave remained, that desired to hold more power over the slaves and working class. Even before the Emancipation Proclamation was declared by Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, a very radical abolitionist, and August Willis, Joseph Wiedemer, Karl Schweitzer, and Louis Blanquer, and Franz Sigel, all called for blacks and workers to volunteer within the Union Army to fight against the slave aristocrats of the United States of America. And many did. Many have even fled to northern lines and signed on to the Union Army. Why? Because they knew that this was a struggle among the working class and among slaves that was formatted by slaves themselves and would be fought from the slaves themselves and essentially be enforced by slaves. Karl Marx and various other radicals all knew that in Haiti and America was emancipation for slaves sudden and quick and enforced by former slaves themselves. Even with the various bureaucratic distortions of the American bourgeois state that the Republican Party that sided with the working class and represented the working class interests ended up being a part of, despite all those bureaucratic distortions of what I would call the Second American Revolution and the Socialist Revolution of America, it was still entirely in the interest of the working class, and the actual infantry and various other fighters within the Union Army were workers and volunteered to fight within it in a desire to destroy the economic system and the political structure that has essentially alienated and has exploited and has very much oppressed the people of America for so long. No more will they adhere to slave aristocrats or to capitalist employers. Now it is them who must essentially decide the lives entirely, for they are the majority of society, and there will indeed be a tyranny of the majority if the majority cease to be. And when the American Civil War was declared, when the Confederacy was entirely declared in rebellion against the Union, the various German communists that essentially immigrated within America and essentially seek to influence a lot of the politics within America, and successfully did, ended up then essentially taking a step further and deciding and be involved directly within the American struggle. The various people, such as Joseph Wiedemer, was an entire lieutenant within the Union Army that led soldiers that essentially volunteered within him, that was very close to him. August Willich as what did the same. Fritz Ankel also did as well. Karl Schwarz, Louis Becker, Franz Segel, and Gustav Stroff, and Friedrich Hecker, all of the German communists that was very much involved within the Republican Party and decided to join within the revolutionary efforts and within the revolutionary politics of the United States of America, now finally themselves got back to their 1848 revolutionary days and decided to directly be in the involvement within the American Civil War and enforce the entire rule for there to be a liberation of the working class and slaves entirely, based on the powers of the workers and the slaves themselves, where they would be the elected leaders and the revolutionary thinkers at the time to try and influence and to essentially stand amongst the workers and the slaves among them as well, and to help with their struggle, to fight for their in the fight of their liberation. These entire efforts and these entire brigades would essentially be called Red Brigades or Red Infantry, that were volunteer infantries within the Union Army that was essentially organized by the people themselves and sided with the Union themselves entirely. There was even efforts within the Deep South that even sided with the Union originally, or even made their own entire side as well, that actually had sympathies with the Red Brigade. An example here would actually be the Free State of Jones, when former Confederate soldiers that were drafted within the Army defected of their organizations and decided to live among the woods and acted as a nuisance against the Confederate aristocrats, and declared a Free State of Jones that would see themselves away from the bureaucratic distortions of the United States of America, but in the siding of the working class and the slaves in their fight against the Confederacy, and would essentially declare war and declare an active existential threat against the Confederate States of America deep into Mississippi. Even in Sherman's march to Georgia, the various Red Brigades that was even led by August Willich and Joseph Wiedemer was actually a very important role into playing onto the captures of various cities within Georgia, such as Atlanta, and various other factors within America into the seizing of the South. Not only was this the sympathies of the entire Red Brigades, but now this was actually starting to get closer entirely with the sympathies of the Republican Party entirely. In his first annual message to Congress in December 3rd of 1861, Abraham Lincoln says, quote, "It is not indeed nor fitting here that the general argument should be made in the favor of the popular institutions, but there is one point, with the connections not so hackneyed as most others, to which I ask a brief attention. It is the effort to place capital in equal footing with, not above, labor in the structure of government. It is assumed that labor is available only in connection with capital, that nobody labors unless somebody else owning capital somehow by the use of it induces him to labor. This assumed the next considered wealth whether it is best that capital share hire laborers and thus induce them to work by their own consent, or buy them and drive them to it without their consent. Having proceeded so far, it is naturally concluded that all laborers are either hired laborers or what we call slaves, and further, it is assumed whoever is a once hired laborer is fixed in that condition for life. Now there is no such relation between capital and labor as assumed, nor is there any such thing as a free man being fixed for life in the condition of a hired laborer. Both of these assumptions are false and interference from them as groundless. Labor is prior and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor, and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is superior of capital and deserves much of the higher consideration. Capital has its rights, which are worthy in the protection as any other rights, nor is it denied that there is and probably always will be a relation between labor and capital producing mutual benefits. The error is assuming the whole labor of community exists within that relation. A few men own capital, that a few avoid labor themselves, and with their capital hire or buy another few to labor for them. A large majority belong to neither class, neither work for others, nor have others working for them. In most southern states, a majority of the whole people of all colors are neither slaves nor masters, while in the north, now within the northern, a large majority of neither hirers nor hired. Men with families, wives, sons, and daughters work for themselves on their farms, in their houses, in their shops, taking a whole product of themselves and asking no favors of capital on the one hand, nor of hired laborers or slaves on the other. Abraham Lincoln, First Annual Message, December 3rd, 1861. Now, obviously, I have critiques of Abraham Lincoln here, as even a Marxist should. He still says that capital entirely is still not a threat entirely at all. I would disagree. Capital in of itself, even by his own by his entire own narrative here, is the accumulation of labor. That's the entire point of capital. That is taking away the labor of an actual human being, a very special thing that defines of a person and defines people of who they are and on their own contribution to society, taking that away and providing some form of commodification of their ability to work, and then providing them a wage that would cut the actual amount of the money time labor of the money value of the labor time that they would perform into the work day, that they would produce in value every time they go to work, and not actually reap the fruits of the labor that they would actually produce by facilitating the surplus value that they would produce each time they go to work. Thus, in a way, capital indeed is a problem, and the accumulation of capital is indeed the problem. Thus, it's no longer that there should be a middle class that should work together and essentially exchange commodities just based on their own production, but rather that there should actually be the entire full abolition of the market, the full abolition of employment, and the entire full power of products being used as utilities and not as commodities entirely. Regardless, though, Abraham Lincoln was very much against the bourgeoisie and was against the slave aristocrats. However, his solution to it, honestly, is more of a workerist capitalist, or let's say a petty bourgeois capitalist solution, rather than actually, abolishing capitalism as the economic activity that has led to these class dominations and led to this class rule in the first place. This is why Karl Marx was possibly, and this is why Karl Marx and the German communists in America was possibly more superior to Abraham Lincoln, because they saw that the root problem entirely was the capitalist mode of production itself, and not the fact that the bourgeoisie just had control into the means of production or had control over slaves or workers, but rather that the mode of production led to this system happen. It led to this rule in the first place, and that their message was that these elites and these classes was actually just a problem amongst the root problem of the entire thing. Either way, the cause of the Union within the United States of America was still the cause of the working class, and the working class saw in their see fit to abolish the entire system regardless of even the opinions of Abraham Lincoln, and were able to deal with Abraham Lincoln, for he saw some of the same interests and a lot of the same interests as the working class of America and the slave class within America as well. And not only just the working class and slave classes in America, but just even the proletariat and working class as well within Europe, or the proletariat and working classes interchangeably. The working class of Europe also saw a cause with the Union. While with conservative aristocrats within Germany and various bourgeois private property owners in Europe actually sided with the Confederacy, so that way they can actually have access to cheaper and high quality produced and extracted cotton as a commodity. Various radicals, labor organizations, and revolutionary proletarian parties sided with the Union and said that the Union cause entirely would be a lot more substantiable and be a lot more favorable for the cause and for the emancipation of the working class entirely. And not even just the working class, but to actually see a society to where all of humanity can indeed reap the fruits of their labor as freely associated laborers. In a way where Karl Marx himself even put it about the American Civil War, he says in The Civil War in America, quote, "What would in fact take place is not the dissolution of the Union, but a reorganization of it, a reorganization of the basis of slavery under the recognized control of the slave-holding oligarchy. The plan of such a reorganization has begun openly proclaimed as the principle of the speakers of the South at the Congress of Montgomery, and explains the paragraph of a new constitution which leaves it open in every state of the old Union joined the new Confederacy. The slave system would infect the whole Union. In the northern states, where Negro slavery is a practice unworkable, and the white working class would gradually be forced down to the level of harlotry. This would be fully accorded and loudly proclaimed as a principle of the only certain races are capable of freedom, and the actual labor is the lot of the Negro in the South and the North of the lot of the German and Irishman, or their direct descendants. The present struggle between the South and the North is therefore nothing but a struggle between the two social systems, the system of slavery and the system of free labor. The struggle has broken out because the two systems can no longer live peacefully side by side on the North American continent. It can only be ended with the victory of one system or the other." Karl Marx, The Civil War in America. Karl Marx even not only says, but this is a part and a power from the working class within the United States, but even says that there's a fight within the international working class as well, as I just said before, in another article called On the Cotton Crisis, where Karl Marx says, quote, "What then does the Chamber of Commerce recommend? The English government ought to then remove all obstacles of the administrative character that still impede the cotton cultivation in India. In particular, it ought to lift the import duty of 10% with which English cotton yarns and textile fabrics burned in India. The regime of the East India Company had hardly been done away with. East India had hardly been incorporated in the British Empire when Palmerston introduced the import duty on English manufacturers through Mr. Wilson at that at the same time he sold Savory nice into the Anglo-French commercial treaty, whilst in the French market has opened to English industry to a certain extent, the East Indian market was closed to a greater extent. With reference to the above, Mr. Blaisley remarked that since introduction of the duty great quantities of the English machinery had been exported to Bombay and Calcutta. Factories had been erected of the English style. These were preparing the snatch of the best Indian cotton from them. If 15% of the freight added to the 10% import duty, the rivals artificially called into being through the initiative of the English government enjoy a protective duty of 25%. In general, Bitter represented the express meaning of the merits of the English industry at the protectionist tendency as developing more and more of the colonies in Australia in particular. The gentlemen forget the century of the half colonies protested in vain against the colonial system of the mother country, and that the colonies demanded free trade. England insisted on prohibition. Now England preaches free trade, and colonies find against England bitter suited to their interests. Karl Marx on the cotton crisis. In other words, Karl Marx saw America and the American Civil War as an anti-slavery war, but also a workers' revolution within America. And with the American Civil War, as Marx saw it, it wasn't merely just a reform project, and it was not merely just two bourgeois states fighting. It was an entire social revolution organized by the workers and slaves themselves, fighting against the systems that had oppressed them for so long. And not only was this entirely a working class revolution within America, but this was a revolution that was massively influencing workers and peasants in Europe at the time. And not only was this influencing workers in Europe at the time, but also workers within colonized nations of Europe, and also even peasants in the colonized nations of Europe, such as in India and Australia. To Marx, the entire American Civil War and what it is not merely just a reform project for the Republican Party to get its interests, but it was a working class effort in order to abolish the entire system as a whole. And an effort entirely to make the revolution permanent until all forms of oppression and until all emancipation of labor and until all fraternity of labor is realized around the globe. Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, a part of the First International, had even sent a letter directly to Abraham Lincoln congratulating him on his re-election, and proceeded to ask that Abraham Lincoln to decide and to make the entire war about slavery and not just the preservation of the Union. For there was an entire material interest and a material reality that the working class and that the slaves sided with the Union, in which that slavery would be abolished, knowing that the Republican Party did call for the abolition of slavery, and that the slaves and the workers had the same interest into abolishing slavery as well. 2 weeks after that letter was sent, the Emancipation Proclamation was declared by Abraham Lincoln. However, the consequences and desires of the American Civil War will not come to be. After the American Civil War ended and the Union did indeed win over the Confederacy, various things did happen to where a lot of the desires of the working class and a lot of the desires of the proletariat was essentially not realized, nor was it actually instituted within America. In 1865, or after, basically just after the American Civil War ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and the radical Republicans, a part of the Republican Party, had lost a lot of their seats and lost direct control of the actual White House that was essentially the leader of the commander force of the standing army of the United States of America, and Andrew Jackson, a sympathizer with the Confederacy, had taken the presidency and started the reconstruction of the South, to where there would be compromise with the Confederacy, and the bourgeois state of the United States of America would still allow capitalism to be, but would result into the abolition of the slave law within capitalism. Thus, one thing that we have to realize about the American Civil War and the American Socialist Revolution that did take place at that point, as in the American Civil War itself, although it was a working class revolution, and although it was entirely of a revolution that had the interests of the workers themselves, the workers had too much adherence and too much dependency to the bourgeois state of the United States of America, to where when the very person and when the very radicals that essentially that were workers themselves and had desire to be part of the United working class, instead of making a worker state in which the workers would essentially be in direct control of the political affairs of the system, they essentially adhere to a bourgeois state to where the bureaucracy and various unelected elites and also various elites and various officials that were elected by the bourgeoisie would decide policy and politics for the working class, to where the very interests and the full interests that the majority of the population did desire would not actually get in full extent, and would rather have compromise with the same enemies that they had fought against entirely in order to accumulate more capital and to keep the population happy in times of oppression instead of abolishing the oppression entirely. Thus, despite being a workers' revolution, instead of establishing a dictatorship of the proletariat, they were too adherent to a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And thus, there was no entire full extent for an actual democracy to be established, but there was still an adherence to a bureaucracy, despite the fact of a majority interest to abolish slavery and a majority interest siding with the bureaucracy. There was still a bureaucracy regardless that allowed for then the results of a revolution to not be instituted, and thus a counter-revolution of property, as W.E.B. Du Bois would call it, was instituted within America and would essentially stay there for quite a long time. After the American Civil War, Jim Crow segregation was essentially instituted, and the various struggles that the slaves and the workers had fought for was continuously ignored, as the workers and slaves had to deal with it without direct representation or direct vote within the bourgeois state at the time. These problems are still around today, and a lot of it has to do with even the 13th Amendment today, where slavery is still enacted within the prison system, for one, and as well as the fact that there is still indeed some form of racial color bias and also working class oppression from the state to the working class of America entirely, from the use of the standing army and the police force against it, while previously the workers had even had an adherence to the police and to the standing army as well. Regardless, the American Civil War is possibly the biggest socialist revolution that America has ever seen in its time. And the working class, despite all the bureaucratic distortions that they saw within it, they still sided with the Union and still saw that there was entire massive potential for the ending of slavery and for there to be a freedom of all labor entirely. This unfortunately did not come to be, and the actual results and the actual fight for that entire abolition of capitalism, for the abolition of the accumulation of capital, for the abolition of the facilitation of capital, and for the freedom of all labor entirely, and for meaningful freedom, and for a rule of democratic majority is still in fight today, where we, the American Socialists, and various other American Socialists today, and not just the American Socialists, but Socialists around the world, and that various other people around the world too, need to fight for when we call for the liberation of humanity entirely. So, let's celebrate the American Civil War despite its clear degeneration and despite, well, its degeneration that was unavoidable or almost unavoidable from the start, due to the adherence to the bureaucracy and due to the adherence to the bourgeois state. and as well as the fact of a lack of a revolutionary theory that would provide such an idea of a dictatorship of the proletariat and provide such an idea of a vanguard party as well. Regardless, this was still a working class revolution despite its failure, and despite the fact that it was not able to establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. 10 years later in Paris, the Paris Commune was declared, to where a dictatorship of the proletariat was indeed established, and the first workers' state in the world was instituted in reality. So, to that, Juneteenth and the American Civil War is not necessarily just a civil war from the Union against the Confederacy, but it was a working class revolution from below, made by the workers, for the workers, by the workers. Unfortunately, however, in the end, there was still a substitution over the workers, to where the adherence to the bourgeois state left the entire point of a self-emancipation from the proletariat distraughted and was ignored by the bureaucrats, a part of the bourgeois state. That is the fight today, and that is what we fight today, and that's the entire point of socialists today. And that's where we essentially had to go to, and we had to essentially move to and had to fight for today, and where we as socialists in America and also in Canada, Mexico, England, France, Europe, all of Europe, all of Asia, all of North America, all of South America, all of Oceania, all of Africa, have to fight for today and fight for the entire emancipation and the entire change of the system as a whole. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this video, hit the like button down below. I'd very much appreciate it. If you're new to my channel, hit the subscribe button. I'll also very much appreciate it. And share this video with others so that way we can get these messages and get a lot of this history too out there, in which others can essentially be educated and others can know about a lot of the revolutionary aspects of, history and how it essentially produced around the world. Anyways, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a great day.